What if the United States had never repealed Prohibition, and alcohol had stayed illegal for generations? In our timeline, Prohibition began in 1920 when the 18th Amendment made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. The Volstead Act gave the federal government the power to enforce the ban. For the first time in American history, a popular recreational substance was outlawed nationwide. The goal was to reduce crime, corruption, and family violence, but the consequences would reshape the country in ways nobody predicted. Prohibition did not appear out of nowhere. For decades, temperance groups had argued that alcohol destroyed families, caused poverty, and corrupted politics. Religious leaders, women's organizations, and progressive reformers joined the movement. By the time the United States entered World War I, anti-German sentiment had also turned Americans against German-owned breweries. The 18th Amendment passed quickly, and supporters believed they were building a cleaner, more moral nation. When legal bars closed, illegal ones opened. Speakeasies spread through every major American city, hidden behind unmarked doors, bookcases, and basements. They became symbols of rebellion, jazz music, and flapper culture. For many Americans, especially in cities, drinking did not stop. It simply moved underground. The law that was supposed to protect morality instead created a thriving black market and turned ordinary citizens into lawbreakers. The biggest winners of Prohibition were organized crime syndicates. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago built empires by smuggling liquor, bribing officials, and running illegal distilleries. Bootlegging became a billion-dollar industry. Criminal organizations gained wealth, political influence, and public fame that they had never enjoyed before. Law enforcement struggled to keep up, and juries often refused to convict popular bootleggers. Enforcing Prohibition required a massive expansion of federal police power, but Congress never provided enough funding or agents. The Bureau of Prohibition was understaffed and underpaid, which made bribery easy. Local police departments often looked the other way. Corruption spread from city halls to Washington. Many Americans lost respect for a law that seemed impossible to enforce and that turned honest people into criminals overnight. When the Great Depression began in 1929, the United States needed money. One obvious source of revenue was alcohol taxes, which had been a major part of the federal budget before Prohibition. Without that income, the government had to rely on income taxes and borrowing. In our timeline, the promise of jobs and tax revenue helped push repeal in 1933. But in an alternate America where moral opposition remained stronger, the government might have kept the ban and searched for other solutions. Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned partly on repealing Prohibition, and the tax revenue from legal alcohol helped fund New Deal programs. If Prohibition had never ended, those programs would have been smaller or funded differently. Public works projects, unemployment relief, and rural electrification might have moved slower. The federal government might have turned to heavier taxes on tobacco, gasoline, or corporate profits, reshaping American business and politics for generations. The temperance movement had been one of the first political spaces where American women organized. Nationally, their activism helped lead to women's suffrage in 1920. In a permanently dry America, women's political groups might have remained powerful, but their focus would have stayed fixed on moral regulation rather than broader economic and social reforms. The feminist movement of later decades might have taken a different shape, with different priorities and alliances. For Prohibition to last, repeal would have to fail. That could have happened if the South and Midwest remained strongly dry, if religious leaders held more political power, or if a national crisis made alcohol seem like a dangerous luxury. A permanent 18th Amendment might have become as difficult to change as the Constitution itself. Once entrenched, the dry lobby would have fought every attempt at reform with the same passion that first created the law. Without repeal, American drinking culture would never have developed in the open. There would be no post-war cocktail boom, no neighborhood bars, no craft beer movement, and no American wine industry in California. Advertising for alcohol would remain banned. Social drinking would stay hidden, associated with crime and rebellion rather than celebration and relaxation. The country's relationship with alcohol would look more like its long relationship with illegal drugs. A dry United States would have created enormous business opportunities for its neighbors. Canada and Mexico would have become major suppliers of legal alcohol to thirsty Americans. Border towns would have boomed with distilleries, breweries, and smuggling routes. The economies of Baja California, Ontario, and border cities like Tijuana and Windsor would have grown far beyond their historical size. American tourists would have flocked across the borders for weekends of legal drinking. If alcohol had stayed illegal, the federal government might have treated it the way it later treated narcotics. Mandatory minimum sentences, undercover stings, and asset forfeiture could have arrived decades earlier. Prisons would have filled with bootleggers and drinkers. Minority communities and immigrants might have faced harsher enforcement, deepening racial inequality. The American criminal justice system would have become even larger and more punitive than it already is. In our timeline, repeal in 1933 stripped organized crime of its biggest source of income. Without repeal, the mob would have stayed rich and powerful for decades longer. Criminal networks might have expanded into legitimate businesses. Unions, politics, and law enforcement. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit could have become even more famous for corruption. Breaking the power of the underworld would have required a much larger and more aggressive federal effort. Illegal alcohol is not regulated alcohol. During Prohibition, thousands of Americans died from poisoned industrial alcohol and poorly made moonshine. Government chemists deliberately added toxins to industrial alcohol to discourage drinking, and bootleggers sometimes failed to remove them. If Prohibition had lasted, this public health crisis would have continued. Hospitals would have treated constant cases of blindness, paralysis, and death from bad liquor. By the 1960s, a permanent alcohol ban would have become a powerful symbol of outdated authority. The counterculture movement might have embraced illegal drinking alongside protests against war, segregation, and traditional values. College campuses could have become centers of underground brewing and political resistance. A long prohibition might have radicalized a generation against federal power, changing the politics of both the left and the right. A century of prohibition might have divided the country more deeply. Urban America would have tolerated or ignored the law, while rural and religious America would have demanded stricter enforcement. States might have legalized or criminalized alcohol locally, creating a patchwork of wet and dry regions. National elections would have turned on the alcohol question again and again, preventing the rise of other political movements and reshaping party coalitions. In a dry 21st century, American cities would look strange. Bars and liquor stores would be replaced by coffee shops, juice bars, and cannabis dispensaries if those had been legalized instead. Tourism to Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean would be enormous. The United States would be one of the few wealthy nations with a nationwide alcohol ban, and the black market would be a permanent feature of the economy. The cultural gap between America and the rest of the world would be wider than ever. This alternate history shows how a single law can shape a nation for generations. Prohibition was meant to improve American society, but it also empowered criminals, corrupted government, and limited personal freedom. The decision to repeal it in 1933 was not just about alcohol. It was about accepting that some bans create more problems than they solve, and that a free society must balance morality with liberty. History is full of moments when a nation chooses its future. The rise and fall of Prohibition was one of those moments for the United States. Imagining a world where it never ended helps us understand why Americans value both order and freedom, and why the debate over what the government should ban will never truly end. The choices made a century ago still echo in the laws, culture, and politics of America today.